She's a difficult woman to deal with on a good day, I murmured, resting my cheek against the top of her head, smelling the faint trace of lavender shampoo beneath the tobacco smoke. You don't have to manage her alone tomorrow, Anna. I'll stay close to you the entire day. When we finally left the park, the afternoon sun had dipped below the mountain ridge, casting long purple shadows across the city and chilling the air. We walked back to the Airbnb in a comfortable, companionable silence, both of us silently dreading the sunrise and the formal farewells it would inevitably demand. That evening, leaving Anna to rest in the quiet security of the apartment, I braced myself and took the short bus ride across town to visit Stefan's childhood home, knowing that failing to pay my respects to his mother before the service would be an unforgivable breach of family protocol. The moment the heavy wooden door of Aunt Vieira's apartment swung open, I was greeted by a wall of heat, the clamor of overlapping arguments, and the unmistakable sour stench of spilled red wine and cheap floral perfume. The hallway was completely congested with second cousins, elderly great-aunts and neighborhood acquaintances, all talking in elevated voices while clutching mismatched glassware filled with local spirits. Aunt Vieira materialized from the kitchen, her eyes red-rimmed and glassy, her hair dyed an impossibly vibrant shade of mahogany that defied her 60-odd years. She seized my face between two hands heavy with gaudy synthetic gemstones, pinching my cheeks hard enough to leave bruises while wailing about how tall I had gotten and how shameful it was that I had abandoned my family for the glamorous streets of Prague. The apartment felt suffocatingly cramped, the familiar furniture of my childhood now crowded by decades of accumulated clutter, and the oppressive weight of collective grief. She dragged me into the kitchen, pouring a generous measure of boxed red wine into a chipped tea mug before fixing me with a sharp, interrogating glare. "Where is that girl?" she demanded, her nasally voice cutting easily through the background chatter. When I explained that Anna was resting at the rental apartment after her long journey from England, Aunt Vieira sniffed disdainfully, waving a ring-covered hand in the air. "London," she spat, pronouncing the city's name like a disease. "Living among the British has completely stripped that girl of her basic manners. She should be here, helping in the kitchen, greeting the family." Her voice suddenly cracked, the angry indignation dissolving into a wet, trembling sob as she leaned heavily against the laminate countertop. If she hadn't abandoned him, Sam, if she had just stayed here and taken proper care of him, my boy would still be alive today. She left him to rot. The sheer injustice of the accusation made my blood boil, a sharp defense of Anna rising in my throat, but as I looked at the broken woman trembling before me, the anger drained away into pity. Her eyes were completely vacant, swimming in wine and denial, desperate to find a convenient target for a tragedy that had been slowly building for over a decade. I knew with absolute certainty that arguing with her would only inflict more pain on a mind that was already fracturing under the weight of a mother's worst nightmare. Instead of speaking, I set my wine mug on the counter, stepped forward, and wrapped my arms around her shaking frame, letting her weep into the wool of my sweater while I stared blankly at the yellowed wallpaper above the refrigerator. I stayed for another hour, fulfilling my familial duty by nodding at old stories and drinking whatever was handed to me, until the alcohol buzzed pleasantly in my temples and granted me an excuse to slip out into the cool night air. When I unlocked the door to the Airbnb shortly before midnight, the apartment was dark and quiet, save for the rhythmic, peaceful breathing of Anna fast asleep in the bedroom. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the moonlight trace the outline of her form beneath the duvet, an overwhelming desire to curl up beside her and escape the cold reality of the weekend pulling at my chest. But we had never explicitly discussed sleeping arrangements, and with my judgment clouded by Aunt Vieira's cheap wine and the emotional turbulence of the day, I didn't trust myself not to cross boundaries that hadn't been defined. Quietly, moving with exaggerated care, I pulled one of the spare wool blankets from the foot of the bed, grabbed a plush pillow from the armchair, and retreated to the living room, collapsing onto the firm upholstery of the sofa and closing my eyes against the spinning room. I was hovering on the edge of sleep when the familiar, icy shiver crept up my arms, causing the hairs on my arms to stand on end as the ambient temperature in the living room plummeted. "So, how was the old lady?" His voice came from the dining area, accompanied by the distinct, wooden scrape of a chair being pulled out and the heavy thud of heels propping up on the tabletop. I didn't open my eyes immediately, drawing a deep preparatory breath through my nose that was instantly assaulted by a rancid, suffocating stench, a mix of rotting cabbage, ammonia, and scorched rubber that was far worse than the night before. All things considered, she's holding up as well as can be expected, I muttered to the ceiling, my teeth chattering slightly as the frost gathered on the coffee table edges. Was she drunk? He asked, a dry, knowing amusement clipping his words. A bit, I replied, finally sitting up on the sofa and rubbing the sleep from my eyes to look across the dim room. But honestly, Stefan, everyone in that house was 3 sheets to the wind. He looked exponentially worse than he had during his initial appearance. The translucent pallor of his skin had curdled into a sickly, jaundiced yellow. His cheeks were drawn so tight against the bone that his skull was clearly visible beneath, and his voice carried a wet, rattling rattle that suggested failing lungs. When our eyes locked across the table, I noticed a violent, erratic tremor in his left eyelid, a nervous tic that had always plagued him during his worst withdrawals when we were younger. Catching my scrutiny, Stefan abruptly swung his feet off the table and stood up, his movements stiff, jerky, and profoundly uncoordinated, as if his nervous system was struggling to transmit commands to his limbs. It'd be pretty damn ironic if they threw a sober wake for me, wouldn't it? He rasped, forcing a hollow laugh as he shambled toward the small decorative bookshelf standing against the far wall. He began pawing through the books and knickknacks with trembling, claw-like fingers, his back turned to me as he muttered to himself. He seized a heavy, decorative statuette, a tourist souvenir depicting a traditional Goral sheep herder clad in heavy robes and carrying a long-handled axe, and lifted it to his face, squinting at the details in the gloom. You think this thing is worth any actual cash, Sam? He asked, his fingernails scraping nervously along the brim of the herder's metal hat. Maybe real bronze or just cheap cast iron? I sat watching him, deeply unnerved by the sight of a ghost attempting to appraise rental property decorations, and replied that I had no idea about its value, trying to redirect the conversation by asking how things were progressing in heaven. Stefan didn't answer immediately. He ran the tip of his pale thumb along the sharp, upturned edge of the herder's miniature axe, pressing down with enough force that I half expected to see ghostly blood well up from the skin. He stood frozen in that testing posture for almost a minute, the silence in the room growing so heavy I could hear the wall clock ticking in the kitchen, before he finally lowered the statuette and shrugged with forced indifference. It's nice really, he said, his voice dropping into a flat, monotone register. Super peaceful. No noise, no stress. It's really expensive up there, Sam. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, completely baffled by the concept. Expensive? What are you possibly paying for in the afterlife, Stefan? He carefully set the Goral herder back onto the shelf, his hands shaking so violently the metal clinked against the wood, before reaching into his hoodie to ignite another of his phantom cigarettes. He kept his back squarely facing me, blowing a thick stream of gray vapor toward the ceiling. Food, he whispered, the word barely carrying across the room. Food, I repeated, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. What kind of food do you need? Stefan didn't elaborate, waving his hand through the smoke to dismiss the question as he slowly turned his head to look at me over his shoulder, his eyes gleaming in the dark. Heaven food, he said evasively, before his gaze drifted past me toward the closed door of the bedroom. Why the hell are you sleeping out here on this uncomfortable couch, Sam? Why aren't you in the bedroom? I stiffened, feeling a sudden defensive flush rise in my cheeks. Anna is sleeping in there, I replied flatly. So what? He shot back, spinning around to face me fully, a wide manic grin stretching across his skeletal face. There was a genuine, old-school camaraderie in his expression, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from his mouth. There were even fewer teeth remaining than the night before, the gums dark and receding around the yellowed stumps. We broke up years ago, cousin, Stefan chuckled, taking an unsteady step toward the sofa. Don't be an idiot. Don't let my dead ass get in the way of you making a move. When the morning alarm began to beep on my phone, I woke to find the living room empty, the air warm and smelling only of stale upholstery and radiator dust. My eyes immediately darted across the room to the decorative bookshelf against the far wall, my breath catching in my throat when I saw that the shelf was completely bare where the statuette had stood the night before. I climbed off the sofa and walked over, running my fingers over the clean, dust-free rectangle of wood where the heavy Goral sheep herder had rested, wondering with a mounting sense of vertigo if my grieving mind was beginning to manufacture physical hallucinations. An hour later, as we sat at the small kitchen table sipping strong black coffee and picking at pastries, I casually asked Anna if she had noticed a bronze sheep herder statuette anywhere in the apartment when she arrived. She paused with her coffee mug halfway to her lips, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion, and shook her head, stating that she hadn't paid any attention to the decorations. Her mind was entirely consumed by the upcoming service. I dropped the subject immediately, deciding that debating the inventory of a rental apartment was a dangerous distraction from the emotional ordeal that lay ahead of us. We dressed in our formal black attire in a subdued, respectful silence, the weight of the day settling over us like a heavy lead blanket as we called a taxi to take us to the municipal cemetery on the edge of town. Before the public ceremony began in the main chapel, the immediate family was granted a private viewing period in the side room, a tradition I usually despised but felt obligated to attend for Aunt Vieira's sake. I hung near the back of the small, chilled room, pressing my shoulders against the wood-paneled wall while Aunt Vieira threw herself across the open casket, her wails echoing off the high ceiling with an raw, ugly intensity that raised goosebumps along my arms. When her emotional endurance finally shattered, two uncles had to physically lift her from the coffin and guide her to a front-row pew, where she collapsed into a limp, weeping heap. As she passed me, I noticed with a start that her hands were completely stripped of her signature gaudy rings, her fingers looking naked and vulnerable. I waited until the room cleared before stepping up to the edge of the polished mahogany casket, bracing my hands against the cool wood to look down at the body of my cousin. Stefan looked completely at peace, which is to say he looked absolutely nothing like the chaotic, restless man he had been during his 33 years of life. The mortician had dressed him in a sharp, dark navy suit he would have actively mocked while alive. His skin was heavily powdered to mask the jaundiced pallor of his organ failure, and his thinning hair was parted with an unnatural, rigid precision. There was a faint, serene Mona Lisa smile molded onto his lips, but as I leaned in closer, the harsh fluorescent overhead lighting caught the tiny, glinting ends of surgical thread protruding from the corners of his mouth where his jaw had been wired shut. A cold shudder ran down my spine as I stared at his closed lips, wondering with a morbid curiosity what state his teeth were in beneath the cosmetic wax, or if the mortician had simply removed them entirely to shape his mouth. "Goodbye, Stefan," I whispered into the sterile air of the viewing room, feeling a profound, aching emptiness in my chest, completely certain that the restless spirit touring my Airbnb was nowhere near this preserved shell. During the formal mass that followed, sitting beside Anna in the crowded wooden pews, I was struck by how completely the eulogies divorced themselves from the reality of the man in the box. The speakers, uncles, family friends, and a former high school teacher spoke glowingly of his bright childhood, his athletic achievements in middle school, and his infectious laughter during summer camps, deliberately freezing his biography at the age of 18. There was absolutely no mention of his adulthood, no reference to the lost jobs, the evicted apartments, or the relentless substance abuse that had systematically dismantled his life over the past decade. Anyone who had interacted with him in recent years knew exactly how this story was destined to end, yet by unspoken consensus we all pretended otherwise. When the parish priest ascended the pulpit, his sermon drifted into comforting, universal generalizations about the immortality of the human soul, proclaiming that while Stefan's corporeal form had failed, his spirit would live on forever in our hearts and in the great luminous ether of paradise. As the priest's voice echoed off the stained glass windows, I stared down at my folded hands, wondering with a cold, creeping dread exactly which fractured, desperate parts of Stefan's soul had managed to survive the transition across the veil. After the casket was lowered into the freezing November earth, Anna and I stood side by side at the end of the long receiving line outside the chapel, enduring an endless procession of handshakes and tearful embraces from relatives whose names I had long forgotten. Once the initial wave of extended family subsided, the familiar, aging faces of the class of '09 began to filter past us. Former teammates, classroom rivals, and weekend drinking buddies, all of them looking slightly thickened, balding, and worn down by the passage of time. Anna remained stoic through the greetings until Aunt Vieira approached, pulling her into a desperate, crushing embrace that lasted far too long, both women radiating a rigid, agonizing discomfort that was painful to watch. When Anna finally broke free and stepped up to shake my hand at the end of the line, her fingers were ice cold and her eyes were completely hollow. Without uttering a single word, she tilted her head toward the cemetery gates, and we quietly slipped away from the crowd to share a trembling cigarette behind the stone wall of the chapel. The traditional post-funeral reception, the car, was hosted in the private dining room of a rustic restaurant situated just a few blocks from the cemetery gates. Long tables were laden with heavy platters of roasted meats, potato salads, and traditional pastries, but the collective appetite of the room was noticeably absent. Instead, the guests gravitated immediately toward the bar, where bottles of plum brandy and vodka were being opened with urgent frequency. The first hour passed in a haze of formal toasts and shared condolences, with family members and former classmates clinking glasses to Stefan's memory. But as the alcohol began to take effect and the conversation grew uncomfortably candid, the high school crowd naturally segregated themselves at the far end of the hall. Anna and I dutifully spent 2 hours sitting with the elderly aunts, nodding at repetitive stories about Stefan's toddler years, before the suffocating grief drove us across the room to join our old peers.